All right, I believe we're ready to go. I see a few raised hands. I don't know if anybody's asking anything specific. Okay, well, I'm just going to get started. Okay, so I am Helen Gregory. I am the curator of McIntosh Gallery here at Western University. And I'd like to welcome all of you on this gorgeous, sunny, mid-global pandemic day to the panel discussion for Written on the Earth, which is currently installed at McIntosh Gallery. Unfortunately, the gallery is not open to the public due to the current lockdown, and the show is scheduled to end before the earliest anticipated date when lockdown may be lifted. So before we begin tonight's discussion, I would like to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute towards revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. So with that, I'd like to welcome and introduce the panelists for tonight's discussion. First, I'll just introduce everybody by name. So we have artists Hannah Claus, Patrick Mann, Ellen Moffitt, Joel Ong, Eeva Siivonen, and Matthew Trueman, and lead researcher from the Northern Tornadoes Project, Dr. Greg Kopp. And because we have so many panelists, I'm just going to introduce each speaker with their bio before they present briefly on their work, so as to save everybody the tedium of listening to 7 bios in a row. And after the artists have presented, I'll get the ball rolling with a couple of questions that the panelists have already received. And then after that, I'll take some questions from the audience. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll get to as many of them as I have time for at the end. So Written on the Earth is the second exhibition stemming from a collaborative relationship between the Northern Tornadoes Project, which is a research group in the Faculty of Engineering at Western University, and Professor Patrick Mann. This project aims to create a conversation between the arts and sciences, focusing on a specific research area. When Patrick approached me about this project about 1.5 years ago, I was extremely enthusiastic as it closely aligns with my own research interests on the subject of art-science collaborations. There was a time when arts, science, and commerce were not as separate as we currently think of them today. However, as C.P. Snow so famously laid out in his 1959 lecture, The Two Cultures, a significant rupture developed over time between the two fields, which was, at least in part, the result of the structure of the modern educational system. In the ensuing decades, however, conversations between artists and scientists have been occurring with increasing frequency and are often positioned as pinnacles of productive thinking. In February of this year, the journal Nature published an editorial about art-science collaborations, in which they pointed out that the sciences, as in the arts, public engagement is becoming an essential aspect of many research projects. The writer correctly states that scientific research shouldn't be perceived as a mere subject to be studied and illustrated, any more than the works of art should be perceived as a means of communicating scientific research. So he writes, the alliances are most valuable when scientists and artists have a shared stake in a project and are able to jointly design it and critique the other's work. Such an approach can both prompt new research as well as powerful art. To make a collaboration work, both sides need to be prepared to be surprised and challenged, to invest time in getting to know each other, and to trust their different expertise. So with that, I'd like to introduce Patrick Mann and Dr. Greg Kopp, who will speak a little bit about the genesis of this project. Patrick will talk a little bit about how the artists were all brought together in a 2-day workshop with the engineers to learn about the Northern Tornadoes Project. And after that, each of the artists will give a brief presentation on how they approached their work in response to the discussions that happened when they convened with the engineers. So Dr. Greg Kopp is the Impact WX or Impact Works chair in severe storms engineering, lead researcher in the Northern Tornadoes Project, and a professor in Western University's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He received a BSc in mechanical engineering from the University of Manitoba in 1989, a Master of Engineering from McMaster in 1991, and a PhD in mechanical engineering from University of Toronto in 1995. His expertise and research relate to mitigating damage to structures during extreme windstorms, such as tornadoes and hurricanes. He works actively to implement research findings into practice, currently serving as chair of the ASCE 49 Standards Committee on Wind Tunnel Testing for Buildings and Other Structures, and as a member of various other building code committees. A former Canada Research Chair in Wind Engineering, he is also the lead researcher for, and I love this, the Three Little Pigs project at the Insurance Research Lab for Better Homes. Patrick Mann is an artist, a writer, an educator, and a professor of visual arts at Western University in London, Ontario. Currently, he is director of the School for Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities at Western. Mann's artwork has been exhibited in Canada at the Art Gallery of Hamilton, the Southern Alberta Art Gallery, Museum London, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, internationally in exhibitions in China, France, Norway, and Switzerland, and in numerous print biennales since the early 1990s. Recent Canadian solo exhibitions include McMaster Museum of Art, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the University of Winnipeg. Patrick's collaborative project, Immersion, Emergencies, and Possible Worlds, resulted in a 10-artist group exhibition. The Source, Rethinking Water Through Contemporary Art, presented at Rodman Hall at Brock University in 2014, and with a second iteration, the Living River Project at the Art Gallery of Windsor in 2019. Current and forthcoming solo and group exhibitions include Patrick Mann, Messengers Forum at Thames Art Gallery in Chatham, and Guardianship and State at Museum London, which is co-curated by Patrick Mann and Jeff Thomas, and will have a forthcoming group exhibition, as well as ongoing community projects. So with that, I turn it over to Patrick and Greg.
So I think you're going to go first, Greg.
All right. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited about this this art show, and I'm looking forward to this panel discussion. If you go to the next slide, Patrick, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just what the Northern Tornadoes Project is, and to give you a sense of that as we also look at the art from the exhibit today. So the Northern Tornadoes Project began in 2017 as a partnership between Western and Impact WX. And really what we're trying to do is identify the data and information for every single tornado that happens in Canada. And Canada is quite a sparsely populated country, so it's actually quite a challenge because a lot of these tornadoes happen in unpopulated areas. We use a variety of tools. If you can go to the next slide, Patrick. We use a variety of tools, and we have a variety of different types of personnel working on this project. So engineers from our team go out and do ground damage surveys after tornadoes when it hits communities, and we take photographs of that and do engineering analysis of the failures that are observed after the tornado occurs. And our meteorologists also use information from satellites. Of course, our Earth is imaged multiple times every day now, and the satellites capture the scars caused by the tornadoes. So we use that to identify tornadoes. And then we use newer technology like drones to fly over and capture detailed information. The other part of our team, though, is we have an anthropologist on the team at York University who actually goes and talks to people after damaging events to understand the personal impacts on them. And so we try to capture all of this data, both the infrastructure, what's happening in the natural world, and what's happening to people. And then we archive all of that and make it available, and then we do various analysis from it. The next slide. So we have lots of imagery in this project. It's an image intensive kind of project for the most part. And so we we basically are taking lots of photographs of damaged trees and things like that occur. And we analyze those. So we use modern tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence to identify the paths of the tornadoes and to identify the individual trees. Next slide. And modern cameras, of course, have infrared and things like that, which actually helps us to identify trees. So we have this image-rich data set, which we use to identify and classify tornadoes. Then we make that publicly available. If you give the next slide, Patrick. And we put all of that data on the website. And so this is a collaboration with Western Libraries, who manages all of the terabytes of data that we accumulate. And since we began in 2017, these are all the tornadoes that have struck in Canada. And so we've sent researchers to identify tornadoes basically in every province. Last year, the first tornado of the year was on Vancouver Island, of all places. We've sent researchers up to the Northwest Territories, where we identified a tornado, and we've been as far east as New Brunswick. Of course, the bulk of them happen in the prairies and in Southern Ontario, where we live here in London. And so that's a little bit about the project and a little bit of background information. So I'll turn it over to Patrick now to talk about the art.
Thank you, Greg. So I was just thinking to myself, I don't know if Greg came first or wind came first as an interest for me as an artist, but it certainly can be said that Greg Kopp and a number of people involved in engineering at Western have been really enthusiastic about working with artists. And that has definitely included a real openness to creative expressions and ways of having a conversation, you could say, but certainly not the expectation that the artist would be illustrating the work of the scientists. So the image you have here is from an exhibition that I curated at DNA Art Space, and it was entitled A Gust of Wind, and it began in 2015. So what you're seeing here are some of the model buildings that are used for testing in the boundary layer wind tunnel at Western. And so this was really a wonderful opportunity when I first came across these amazing models. And if you saw them up close, you might recognize buildings you've seen. But it was amazing to see these sort of artifacts of engagement with wind. And so this was the first of a number of projects that I personally was involved in. But in 2018, Greg and his team approached me and asked if I would be interested in working on a project involving students. And at the time, I think they were particularly interested in undergrad students on the theme of tornadoes and responding to so-called tornado evidence. So in 2018, I worked with a group of third-year printmaking students, and at the same time, there was the opportunity to bring some other artists on board. So that was the point at which Eeva Siivonen, Helen Moffit, and Matthew Trueman, who are part of this exhibition project, were invited, as well as two other artists. And we basically, they acted as what you might call mentors with the undergrad students. And we basically produced a quite expansive exhibition of basically the print works of the printmaking students, and some experimental artworks by the artists that I've just cited. And the work on the right-hand side here is by Ellen Moffitt. It was another sound piece that, unlike in many ways, some of the work that she's done at the McIntosh Gallery, and she might have a second to maybe comment on that a little later. I think one of the really exciting things, though, was the sort of dialogue involving students and involving the artists that we have here today, but as well the challenge to basically present what I would call a problem like tornadoes to a group of undergrad artists and ask them to engage. And of course, initially they had to decide if they were interested. But of course, I think, as I said to them, a good artist can find a way into just about anything. And one thing I will say parenthetically is one of the really interesting works that was made, and this is, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, was a print work. It was an etching where the student had brought together the idea of tornadoes and viruses. And so I was actually looking for an image of the work and I couldn't find it. And I'm heartbroken about that because it was certainly prescient. Anyway, moved forward to the completion of that exhibition and speaking to Greg and his team further. And there was further interest in more engagement by artists in this kind of work. And the thing I have to say is I was very, not only enthusiastic, but very open to inviting other artists. And so at the time, we were thrilled to be able to invite Hannah Claus and Joel Ong to join in the project. And I myself am now operating as an artist in this project. I was happy to do that because I knew that working with the parameters of this kind of enterprise that's supported by the Northern Tornadoes Project was really, in a sense, an open invitation to investigate and to experiment. It wasn't a brief that required that we somehow speak to tornadoes as the subject of our work. And we had a number of conversations about that very thing. How, as artists, do we think about an opportunity such as this? So we began virtually. I mean, there was some back and forth with sharing of data and information in as much as the artists might want it or not necessarily want to look at it immediately. And then in 2020, we all got together in London, Ontario, and did a workshop. And it was a workshop where the folks from the Northern Tornadoes Project gave us what I think of as a really thorough but also entertaining introduction to their project. We toured the Windy Dome, which is a research site here in London as part of Western, and you'll be hearing a little bit about that site from Joel Ong. We began with an opening talk by Indigenous elder Mike Hopkins, which really brought together ideas around wind, weather, and storytelling. And we had the opportunity to, in essence, get to know each other, but also come to understand that the project didn't have any sort of dictates, that there was really a lot of openness to what we as artists might come up with. Following from that, it was a pleasure to work with Helen Gregory, who came on, or was already acting in the role of curator, but certainly came into that role much more actively. And in that context, she invited two very significant writers to participate in the project. And gradually and happily, the show came into being. I'm not going to say a lot more because you're going to be hearing from the artists, but I do want to thank all of the artists for their really generous engagement with the project, Helen and the McIntosh Gallery for their commitment to the project, and really being very open to a project that had some uncertainties at certain times and lots of other givens. And then lastly, I also do want to thank Greg and the Northern Tornadoes Project, not only for the financial support, which has allowed for new work to be produced, but also for the real openness to a kind of conversation, an art science conversation that I think has been really rich. So I will leave it at that. If I can remember how to unshare my screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was a wonderful introduction to what has been a very, very complex project. And again, I thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. And you are correct in that it was complex and surprising throughout, especially since at the end, the work was, I was seeing it all for the first time as it was installed. So it's been exciting and challenging. So now we're going to hear from each of the artists talking a little bit about their responses to the material that was presented to them at the 2-day workshop. So first, we're going to hear from Hannah Claus. Hannah is a Ghanaian Gehaga and English visual artist who explores Nkwe Hunway epistemologies as living transversal relationships in our transdisciplinary practice. A 2019 ITEL Jorg Fellow and 2020 Prix Giverny recipient. Her work can currently be viewed in exhibitions at the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal, Université de Montréal, and at the McIntosh Gallery, although you can't actually see it at the McIntosh Gallery. She sits on the board at the Conseil des Arts de Montréal and is a co-founder of Daphne, a new Indigenous artist-run center in Montreal. In August 2020, she was hired as assistant professor of Indigenous art practices at Concordia University. Claus is a member of the Tyendinaga Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, and having grown up away from her grandfather's community, she is privileged to live and work in Ganayangehaga territory in Jojage, which is Montreal. So I'll just turn that over to Hannah.
Awesome, Helen. You did a good job.
Sorry, it turns out having it written phonetically was actually worse.
It was worse. Yeah. There you go. We should have met. But anyway, you did a great job. You did a great job. It's not easy. It's not easy. Saigo Serogoigu, Hannah Claus Yanjats. My name is Hannah Claus. And yes, Kanyuk Kehaga, or more commonly known as Mohawk, and English visual artist. I've been learning the language a little bit regularly for a while now, so I like to try and use the words where I can. Okay, so this this tornado project, it was fun to see those images again, Greg and Patrick. I brought back those moments in that little room where we had the PowerPoint presentation and stuff, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody's work. I guess I would say that my work is sort of follows a familiar pattern for what I do for one of the types of work that I do sort of regularly, and I kind of think this is why Patrick brought me on. It was thinking about this sort of thing, and I stuck with it, but I at the same time felt like I was informed with the information that was being shared about the project specifically too. So sharing my screen. And yeah, it sort of started off with this. I thought I'd show how it started off, the suspended installations I do. It's something that begins as a 3D animation. And with this one, it was sort of these two forms that would turn around each other and kind of embrace but not embrace. My inspiration for the work for the project was thinking about the four winds that comes up in the Ohadu-Gariwadekwa, which is the words that come before all else for the Haudenosaunee. It's a way to begin an event, begin a day. The Ohadu-Gariwadekwa, it's like also known as the Thanksgiving address. And one of the things we thank are the four winds. So clearly wind and tornado, that saw a correlation there and thought this was a good way to look at it. The actual work itself then moved into being this. And I want to say a big thank you to Abby, the intern, the assistant, communications person. I don't know her title officially, but she has been sending me documentation and video. It's been amazing because I don't actually see my installations before they're up in the gallery. They're made in sections and panels and packed up and are only together. And I want to say a big congratulations to Helen and to the studio, the gallery technician that actually got it up and happening. So this is a little bit of the video. So the thing that's nice about these installations, as opposed to just static images when you have videos, you can see how the pieces do sort of move with just air currents in the room. So thinking about the four winds, I have these two forms. what these winds do is they're something that bring about renewal and healing. Clearly, the winds introduce the changing seasons and talk about balance. I was speaking with an elder to learn more about how these work, and she mentioned teaching by Tom Porter, in which he talks about they're like two sets of twins, and that the north and the east wind bring a blanket of snow, and the south and the west remove the snow. So I sort of feel this piece is not really tornado. I associate tornado with violence, destruction, great gusting winds. Obviously, this is quiet, gentle. It's a little bit more like breath. I tend to think of it almost as an embrace, but one that's been frozen. I then looked at the name, the words for tornado, and it was interesting because the words that came up were Teyo Werataze, where it's a twisting, turning, rotating winds. And the one that interested me was Gatsi Ska Uni Ata. And relates to the word for a snail, where it has to do with the shell that goes round and round concentrically and the spiral shape. And it means to literally, it makes or causes that shape to happen. So I thought it was interesting that the words in Ganyak Geha didn't bring in the idea of destruction necessarily, but this idea of turning, movement, and to me it relates to that idea of balance that's always necessary in the way we live our lives. So that's sort of what I have to say about that. And I thought I'd finish with this slide because it's a really nice segue into Patrick's work, I think.
Thank you, Hannah.
Let's see, stop share. Perfect.
Thanks, Hannah. That was a stunning work, and it's been hugely popular. It's breathtaking. So now I will introduce Ellen Moffitt. Ellen's projects range from multi-channel sound installations to interactive electroacoustic instruments, and from gallery installations with performative elements to community projects. Rooted in the vocabulary of sculpture, her primary media is sound. Her work explores sound and space, the body and materiality as solo, collaborative, and interdisciplinary projects. Her current creative research into the acoustic properties of materials uses various processes and actions for the live sound generation of sound and using physical interfaces, materials, transducers, and real-time sound processing. Her work has been presented throughout Canada and internationally in solo, group, and touring exhibitions in galleries and offsite locations, including Ramey Modern Gallery in Saskatoon, Gallery 1214 in Vienna, Dunlop Art Gallery in Regina, New Adventures in Sound Art in Toronto, Kafka in Kitchener, the Dalhousie Art Gallery in Halifax, and the Kentler International Art Gallery in Brooklyn. Her collaborations with performance artists, dancers, and musicians have been presented in Toronto, Saskatoon, and Vancouver. Born in Toronto, she has lived and worked across the country. She is currently a PhD candidate at Western University in the Visual Arts Department in Studio. So over to you, Ellen.
Thank you, Helen. I think I would rewrite some of that, the introduction with some of my work, but that's fine. It was very well delivered. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen to start with the work. I have 3 still images of the work in the installation without sound. Eeva has a video that brings the sound into her moving image work. There is a beautiful abundance of cables and an organic techno sensibility that is very strong and a recurring element in a lot of my work. I call myself a sound installation artist predominantly, but my reason for mentioning the word sculpture is the amount of materials that are included within almost all of my projects. So in that way, I think that it still holds true to say it comes out of sculpture and I work with sound. In sound installation, my real interest is in materiality as well as the sensorial, social, and embodied dimensions of sound as relations. With the materiality of sound, that's defined as the fluctuating forces of energy matter. What I'm doing within the project in Written on the Earth is trying to connect the notion of sonic materiality with the materiality, as I perceive it, of tornadoes, as their energy, force, and fluctuation. Of interest to me as well is a comment that Greg had made in our first meeting about tornadoes not making sound, because there always is an assumption that they must roar because of the force they have, rather than the materials within the tornado or within the moving air that is creating the sound in its movement. My approach to Written on the Earth, I love the title. I really like the interface of the human on the earth and the earth writing itself as that kind of juxtaposition. So bringing that up sonically, I started with field recordings of natural and human environments as sonic writings on the earth. I made several recordings from I made more than several. I made recordings from about 12 locations in southwestern Ontario, several from the lakes, from rivers, from the land, from the air. And in processing the field recordings, what I really wanted to achieve with the sound installation was a sense of uncertainty, of not knowing where we are, of a kind of destabilization or decentering of the certainty that we have of where sound might come from, what the sound might be, the relationship between the sound that you hear and what its original site was. In working with the installation, I have speakers of three different types of speakers to enhance the frequency range within the sounds. And then in processing the sounds I've kept it relatively simple, but I have both the original sound recordings as well as manipulated sound recordings. All of the sounds are output using algorithmic processes, which means that there's a continuous evolution of the sound as a composition. Just to make a small point in connection with Patrick's question about the project I did 2 years ago, I consider that what I was working with there was also a level of destabilization using sound. And it was much more physical because people sat on that yoga ball on a daisy table, so they moved around in space as they were listening to sound that was output and rotating itself in the 4 speakers. So there was a real sense of physical movement. That was a very real movement. In this installation, there is not that, it's a listening experience, but there's, with the experience in the installation, the magic of it, as far as I'm concerned, is the interface between the work of sound and the work of moving image. Eeva and I worked together, but we worked in parallel ways. We each had our independent lines of investigation and media that we were using. We were aware of what the other person was doing, but we didn't closely collaborate, or perhaps we didn't really collaborate much until we came together in installing the work in the gallery. the way the two works interface is the coincidence as sort of perfect timing, and other times that there's a departure of the image and the sound. So it's a very open way that the two media are coming together that expands beyond sort of a collaborative two-person use of the same space. And I think that in us working in parallel ways and sharing a kind of an aesthetic allows the two forms of media to come together as in a dialogic way without one overpowering the other. So I think that this is it provides a really beautiful meeting point as a conjunction of the two separate ways that we have of working. So I think that that's all I need to say, or I have to say right now.
Helen? Yeah, I just want to comment on how exquisite really the interaction is between your work and Eva's. I mean, I know that I think I've seen the two of you, do sort of live performances together, and so I already knew that your work was incredibly sympathetic, and it was still quite amazing to experience the two works installed together, and those sort of incredible moments of serendipity and synchronicity when it's, and the astonishing thing is that it's purely unplanned, that there are these kind of moments of coincidence where like there's a sound and an image and they just occur simultaneously with such perfection that the idea that it was purely unplanned is really astonishing. And when people have come in to see the show, and I've said, do understand that these are actually two separate works, and I said, but you'll find these moments, and then they come out and they're just like, it's so incredible because they weren't really convinced by what I told them, and then these moments happen, and it's frequently enough that it just, yeah, it's really a beautiful thing. It really is. And so with that, I will now introduce Eeva. Eeva Siivonen is a moving image artist originally from Helsinki, Finland. In her work, she sutures together visual and sonic spaces where the small and forgotten becomes visible and amplified in an effort to create space for attention and empathy. She holds an MFA in video art from Syracuse University, where she studied as a Fulbright scholar. She has an MFA in documentary film directing from Aalto University in Helsinki. She is currently pursuing a practice-based PhD in art and visual culture at Western University in London, Ontario. Her work has been screened internationally at film festivals, gallery exhibitions, and video art events. Most recently, her work has been screened at San Francisco Cinematheque's Crossroads Festival, at Barcelona International Short Film and Video Festival, and at Transient Visions Festival of Moving Image. Previously, her work has been screened at Black Maria Film Festival, Montreal Underground Film Festival, and Aubagne International Film Festival, among others. She's also participated in gallery exhibitions such as Visions at the Nunnery Gallery in London, UK, and Were the Eye Not Sunlike, a collaborative video art exhibition organized by Acre TV, Fernway Gallery, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. She's received residency fellowships at multiple international artist residencies, most recently Helen Wurlitzer Foundation in New Mexico, Goodman Artist Residency in Massachusetts, Terra Foundation in Giverny, France, and Munson Williams Proctor Art Institute in Utica, New York. So over to you, Eeva.
Thank you. It's horrible listening to your own.
I should have made them shorter.
Okay, so I have a video to share. It might be a little choppy, so hopefully you get a sense. Okay. So I made like a little documentation of this space. So this includes kind of my work with Ellen's audio piece together. And yeah, hopefully we'll play okay. We'll see. Wait, did you see that? Oh, wow, okay. Let's try that again, just a sec.
Yeah, I was seeing Ellen's screen.
Okay, sorry.
Do you want to try that again?
Yep, just a sec. Is that better?
I'm seeing you, but I'm seeing. No, that's it. Okay.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. So, yeah, I don't know how choppy that was in playing it online, but hopefully you got some sense of it. I was sharing a black screen for some reason for a little bit, so it was a little confusing. I could see the video, but I was sharing a black screen. And then I have a still image of one of my sort of pink TV screens. So I guess for me, because I don't normally work with kind of a scientific discourse, or I don't respond to kind of scientific data in my work. So I think finding kind of the angle for a project like this was an interesting challenge to take on. And I was sort of trying to find a way that would still be like very much in line with like my interests and the kind of work that I do, but in some way responding to the theme of the show, or at least some sort of aspect to it, and also wanting really to work with specifically video and kind of like using the medium of video in some way where that medium and the specific qualities of the medium were sort of present and important in the work. And I think for me, the angle that I sort of found was initially actually came from like the visual imagery that Greg and the Northern Tornadoes Project showed us. For example, like foundations of houses that have had sort of been completely destroyed by the tornadoes, and thinking about like climate change and ecological grief and things like that. I've been sort of thinking through lately, and the kind of collective experience of having to come to terms with this sort of disappearance of all these things that are like valuable and important. So sort of that image of a home destroyed was, I think, maybe a starting point for me in some way. And then just thinking about sort of the theme of disappearance in relation to like climate change. And I wanted to sort of respond to it in a visual kind of effective way. And I thought of the videos as sort of like video for me. A lot of why it interests me is like it's kind of has a beautiful ability to kind of capture this sort of disappearance and emergence of things in images because of the sort of time and movement. So I kind of wanted to do something that captures that, and wanted to create sort of a work that has its own kind of rhythm and almost like its own ecology. So it's almost like its own sort of weird media organism almost. And I guess in thinking about how the works, not a collaboration, but how the works with Ellen came together, I think for me, we sort of had parameters in the beginning that I think kind of framed it for me in a way. Like I knew we would be working in a very kind of dark space, and it would be this sort of immersive space. And then I think Ellen's work kind of was like always sort of in my mind as this sort of unknowable kind of absence. And I was sort of like, I'm giving kind of the sound element of the space to whatever Ellen's going to do, and it's going to be this sort of like unknowable part, and it's going to kind of like intersect and change my work completely. So I think the way I approached this like specific work was kind of knowing that it's going to be transformed in really like unexpected ways when it's being installed. And yeah, I don't know if Ellen had a similar sort of awareness of like if it's going to change completely and become something completely different once it's actually in the space. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I think that's probably all I have to say.
Thanks, Eva. I'm not going to get too chit-chatty in between everybody's presentations, I don't think, because I am looking at the time, and we're motoring right along here. So next we'll have Matthew Trueman. Matthew is an artist based in London, Ontario. He works primarily in sculpture, site-responsive installation, and video exploring Western culture's relationship with the landscape through technology. This focus on technology was inspired by his background in engineering. He holds an MFA from Western University. His recent series of site-responsive installations, Instruments for Landscapes, Black Rocks, was the recipient of the 2019 Environmental Installation Award at Ocean Alliance in Gloucester, Massachusetts. In 2018, his Instruments for Landscapes, Pine Grove, was created during a residency at iPark Foundation in Connecticut. Matthew has had previous exhibitions at DNA Art Space, that's here in London, McMaster Museum of Art, Thames Art Gallery, Westland Gallery, which is also in London, and Museum London, Nuit Blanche, and here London. His photographic works have been published in So Long South Street by Huron and Erie Press. So I'll hand it over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Helen. I think the first thing I will do, similar to Eva, is show a video of my installation, just so everyone can get an idea of what it looks like. And then I'll give a sort of a thought process of what I was getting into when I started working on it. Let me just navigate here. Okay, can everyone see this? All right. I'll just put this up as a background. So the last frame on the video was a series or a shot inside the log showing what started out as a charcoal animation of satellite weather footage. And this was my starting point for the project. I just started doing these animations in part because it gave me time to sort of think about what the rest of the project was maybe going to look like. And through doing these projects, it's drawing a frame and then one frame at a time, erasing it and taking the next photo. And eventually you can kind of create an image in this sort of sequence of moving clouds. And it got me thinking about this idea of feedback loops and how things sort of feed back into themselves and evolve over time. One of the thoughts was obviously the clouds, where it's like I draw an image of a photograph it, sort of turn it into a video, and there's this sort of transformation process along the way where all the smudges and the artifacts of the drawing and the sort of the ghosting are sort of visible on the image or on the video. And then I was thinking also about the similar processes in the actual world, where the processes of how water sort of moves inland through evaporation. It rains and it comes down in rivers, and it's sort of this cyclical process, but it's always sort of evolving and changing on each step. And one of the other things I was thinking about was how do we, how could I, as just a singular person, sort of influence this process? And I was thinking, well, what happens if I sort of yell into the space? It creates, if you're in an enclosed room, it'll create an echo, which is almost like a dialogue of yourself and the atmosphere. And you sort of wither away into decay. But if if there was a way to sort of, every time the echo, you heard it back, it could get a little bit of a boost, a little bit more energy, it can almost keep repeating itself, and it can kind of almost morph into something maybe similar to these water systems where there's this sort of source of energy and it's sort of this sort of slow churning of a process where it's always sort of maintaining itself and kind of evolving over time. So one of the things I was thinking about is trees, obviously, they have this the same process in the atmosphere where they suck up water from the ground and they sort of evaporate into clouds, and they kind of help maintain this these cyclical weather systems. But what would happen if there was sort of a way for trees to do this almost more actively, and more importantly, what would that even look like? So this series is called the Echo Keepers, and it involves a series of sort of multimedia displays in these tree trunks where they have speakers in them. And the way the sound resonates, you really get a sense that the sound is coming all sort of linked together from a space below the floor surface. And in each tree is a projection or some sort of showing the interaction of sort of the water and air and how everything sort of flows together. And I was just kind of curious what these beings might look like as almost like a non-human way to control the weather, but in this almost in an allegorical sense. Yeah, so those were some of the thought processes behind the work. And yeah, I'm quite curious to see how they sort of evolve over time. But I think I will end my screen share here if anyone has thoughts.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to, again, move right on to Patrick and then Joel, because I'm hoping maybe that after everybody's done their individual presentations, when we sort of move into a question period, maybe we can try to get a little more conversational. I'm hoping. I mean, I know it's difficult in a Zoom structure. So I won't reintroduce Patrick because I have already done so. So I'm just going to let Patrick hop right on in here.
Thanks, Helen. I'm just going to share my screen. I actually have quite a number of slides that I'm going to show quite quickly, partly because I want to talk about wind and weather and post-weather. So this is a work done by Alida Brennan-Linga, who was in the exhibition I curated called The Gust of Wind. And I show it because I think it interestingly reminds us that basically especially in the history of art, in order to actually kind of picture wind, we need some sort of index. And so in this case, she made this beautiful little flapping paper index that she put in front of a mountain. And so I think that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of work that I've been doing regarding the environment and weather. And ultimately started thinking about this work that I had done based on a small house in Baker Lake. And there were 24 drawings in the series. And if I think about this work now, I recognize that ultimately weather is something that is operating onto our experience, you could say. So there is this kind of inference that nature produces weather, nature so-called. And I think that certainly this project and the experiences I think we're having in the times in which we live suggests that not only is nature, in quotes, not a kind of benign producer of weather, but in fact, it's perhaps the human that is producing weather. So I'm going to keep going. There's 24 of these, but I think you get the idea. So when I came to this project, I did know that I wanted to try and address some of these images of what some of us would call disaster, but even that seems somewhat problematic because it's a disaster for the human, I think, when a tornado occurs. But I'm not necessarily certain if, broadly speaking, tornadoes are always disasters for the earth. But I knew that I wanted to try and address these images, or at least images like this. And these are actually from Alonza, Manitoba in 2018. And I did have a strong sense that what I wanted to deal with was something like post-weather, or something like the problem of the interface between the tornado and the human. And so these are the works that I produced, and I'll show you some details after. And it was a real pleasure to be in the room, as it were, with Hannah's piece and with Matt's piece. What I decided to do was a kind of process where I wanted to kind of quiet the image and actually somehow kind of make the image fixed in a particular way. And being a so-called printmaker by training, I took up a technique that is a bit like printmaking, except that this was literally just carved into a mat board. And so I had a strong sense that, in essence, I wanted the work to counter, you could argue, the kind of violence that we associate with the images that I just showed you. And also, I think through doing the process of making these works, there was a sense in which I was producing images that are fundamentally like at a threshold. So this is one of the two finished works. I'll show you the other. And in essence, I carved the image out. And then ultimately, I produced this kind of layer, other layers of information, in fact, using silver watercolor, which was a way of kind of drawing the lines out after they had been, in a sense, disappeared by being cut into the board. And then there was this dot pattern. And I have worked with these series of kind of systems of information like dots quite a lot. But in this case, I had seen this work in the collection of the McIntosh Art Gallery. So this is by Serge Toussignan, and the work is entitled Environment Transform, #1 Dotscape, made in 1976. And so it struck me that in 1976, artists working with a kind of landscape intervention like this were fundamentally treating the landscape, you could argue, as somewhat benign or a kind of opportunity for a sort of intervention. In this case, I don't think he planted the plants, but he photographed them and then picked up on the kind of dot-like system that the plants describe with the kind of frame around the image. And so I had decided that I wanted to use this kind of dot pattern as, in a sense, a way to kind of capture a sense of, or infer a sense of kind of order. And of course, what happened was with these, you could argue they're sort of like veils, the sort of veil of silver watercolor and the veil of dots. It had the effect of, as I say, or as I described, creating, I think, for myself, a sense of a kind of threshold image. So an image that is caught in a state of suspension, whereby you actually do need to get up close to the work to actually read the image more substantially. So this is just a really brief video that was shot by Abby. Thank you very much. And I will just run it. So it'll give you a little bit more of a sense of the way the work functions. What I need to say is that around the work is, if you haven't seen it, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell this, but it's framed with a frame that also has an almost disappeared text, if we wanted to call the image itself a kind of text. And these texts were from the reports that the Northern Tornadoes Project made after they did the investigation of the sort of the damage that had occurred at Alonza in 2018. So, for example, in this case, it says there were 14 people in the basement at the time of the tornado, all members of the same extended family, and it talks about the way they survived. So in essence, I think that introducing this text was definitely another form of kind of indexing or linking this subject to a specific kind of incident. And I think that for me, that also picks up on the history, I think, in graphic art of a kind of connectedness with the experiential and the everyday, and even a form of reportage. So in as much as I think the images don't really report very substantially on the event, such as was described in the photographs I showed you, I was interested in another treatment of the image, but still holding on to that sense that the work is meant to do some telling, in spite of the fact that it has this other kind of ephemeral quality. So I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm now going to turn it over to Joel because, again, I am trying to be cognizant of time. Okay. Let me just zoom back to Joel's. Okay, here we go. Joel is a media artist whose work connects scientific and artistic approaches to the environment, particularly with respect to sound and physical space. He is an assistant professor in computational arts and director of Sensorium, the Center for Digital Arts and Technology at York University. Professor Ong's work explores the way objects and spaces can function as repositories of frozen sound. And in elucidating these, he's interested in creating what systems theorist Jack Burnham refers to as art that does not reside in material entities, but in relations between people and between people and the components of their environment. A serial collaborator, Professor Ong is invested in the broader scope of art science collaborations and is engaged constantly in the discourses and processes that facilitate viewing these two polemical disciplines on similar ground. His graduate interdisciplinary work in nanotechnology and sound was conducted at Symbiotica, the Center for Excellence for Biological Arts at the University of Western Australia, and supervised by BioArt pioneers and TCNA, that's the Tissue Culture and Art Project, artists Dr. Ayana Zur and Oran Katz. His current artistic practice builds on his doctoral studies in data aesthetics and social activism from the University of Washington in the emerging environments of a post-pandemic future. So I'll pass that right back over to you, Joel.
Thanks so much. I'll share my screen. You're right. It is horrific to hear that being read back to yourself, you know. But I'm going to jump right in. My piece is called Variations in Aeolian Dynamics. Aeolian for contained winds. And, you know, Patrick, that was an amazing presentation. And I think, you know, there's a lot of resonances moving into my piece about the indexicality of the wind, and especially when we enter a facility such as the Windy Dome, and how we are looking at the wind in such a quantized fashion. So my investigations were various, to say the least. I started off with a proposal for at least about 6 or 7 ideas that I wanted to frame as a series of etudes or studies that were then slowly trimmed down to 3. And one of the main ones we were thinking of was an embodied presence within the Windy Dome itself. It was interesting to think about the wind, you know, and tornadoes as a site for, you know, the sublime I guess in the history of, or aesthetic history of wonder and religion. You know, you think of the sublime as something that that has both a sense of awe, but also a sense of fear within. And the essential quality of defining that experience of sublimity is distance, right? And so for us, you know, when we got into the Windy Dome, I realized that, you know, putting something in vitro, something that of that magnitude and of that, to a certain extent, wildness in vitro into an environment like the hexagonal dome, and containing it was in a sense desensitizing the body to the effects of a tornado in the first place. So my instinct was to go in there and feel what it actually did feel like, you know, and as opposed to what Ellen was saying earlier about how tornadoes are actually silent, the Windy Dome is not silent. It is very, very loud. And so when you're in there, you'll have to wear headphones. And when we were in there, we had to wear masks as well as per safety requirements. So we started off, this is Etude 1. You will see this picture elsewhere as well. This is us in the Windy Dome on the first day. This is some of the experiments that we managed to conduct just at the end, at the tail end of, or at least just at the end of the year. And so the dancer that I was working with, Susan Lee, she's a choreographer at York University, and she works with the York Dance Ensemble. we had a lot of conversations about how we would structure this as an improvisation with the wind, but also, focusing on two main points of positionalities. One, from the perspective of the body. How can the body be a diagram of forces of the wind? And the other, how can we see, almost from the perspective of the wind, as it tests the structural integrity of the buildings or the bodies that it hits. So along with that, she did a lot of experiments moving through it. You can't really tell that one. It's pretty choppy. I apologize for that, but such is the latency today. But so she basically did a lot of experiments there. And unfortunately, pretty much the day after we were there, we got notice that we wouldn't be able to continue filming in there at all. The idea was that she would have a series of experiments with her students, and we would all come in back into this dome and have these series of improvisations with them. So in the spirit of all things pivot, I created a new etude or a new study called Vortex Simulation of a Simulation, and I tried to make everything virtual. And it was really to think about, this will be more apparent later, but how the wind is not something that's distant, and in our movements, how our bodies are actually enwinded. This is a great quote by Tim Ingle. But the process of it was basically inviting students from the York Dance Ensemble to respond to a couple of key thematics that I've expressed before this in certain ways, and then having them record themselves on video in their homes or in their spaces. We amassed about 20 videos, and then putting them through a software that would then very crudely put them in a kind of simulation. And of course, this is the pivot that we had to make, and this is the compromise that we had to make because we weren't able to set up a Connect or motion capture system in each of these houses. Move. So these were the experiments that we came up with shortly after. We took the mocap data, and then we first started off thinking about them as the wind itself, and that worked out. So that basically became the piece. We wanted them to embody the dynamics of the wind, and then at some point we started thinking about its relationship to scale and size. Within the dome itself, you feel like you're the same height or maybe almost the same dimensions as a tornado, but actually, there's a vast difference. So the dome in there actually is kind of representative of a dome that's being open, and the tornado and the human actually, or you can call it the spirit, actually kind of bursting forth. And that was basically how it was. So the third study, and I'm just rushing through this really fast, but was the relationship that that came to between the wind and that the body that is actually testing. So Darcy Thompson has this seminal work about the body or form of an object being a diagram of forces that are acting on it, and also this idea that when you build architecture within a natural space, Jane Gaskell has a really interesting thing that the architects have to remind themselves that you always have to include hatred in their tools, because you're not building for the environment, but you're basically building against it. So when the wind is testing the structural integrity, is that the only relationship that we have, the body as a barrier to it, and the body as a kind of and this is really interesting for me when I started talking to Professor Gurma, and thanks so much for everybody who made that possible. And we talked in particular about the late Professor Davenport's wind loading chain, and how this was a series of different qualities, I guess, that you could determine what the wind's load on a particular building would be. And so he talked a lot about the influence of terrain, aerodynamic effects around the shape and structure of the building at the point of impact, dynamic effects. But he also talked about the criteria. And in one of them, he did mention something about the signature of each building. And he talked about it as, determining, and he mentioned something about the signature also being a vibratory or an oscillatory one. And so I started thinking about acoustic signatures. And so I together with him, I made this Verona dome just as a test, and we started drawing these wind patterns with the help of a graphics designer. And then eventually we put these scores together, which were hypothetical musical etudes that were triggered almost by the action of the wind on the edges of buildings. So these are actually scores that you can play. Not in the gallery, unfortunately. That would have been nice. But they were composed and created in Sibelius, and there's an MP3 for each of them. And so yes, I will stop here, but I think more will happen during the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joel. That's amazing. So in the interest of time, because in theory, we're supposed to end at 6:30, which is in 9 minutes, but we've got a few participants. Nobody's dropped off yet. So I don't know. I'm kind of thinking about throwing caution to the wind. Haha. And I know that I had some questions in an order that I had originally planned, but I think I'd actually like to turn it over to Greg first, because I'd like to bring him back into the conversation a little bit more. And I'm also going to check through the Q&A to see if we have any questions that have been proposed by the audience. Oh, I actually can't see any questions. And I'm not sure if that's in the settings. It just says no open questions, so I can't see any questions.
Some people have hands raised.
Let's have a look at that. Nope, I get a raise and lower option. Oh, wait.
Yeah, it says Christoph has his hand raised, maybe.
Okay, and I noticed that Roberta also did, and Abby has just sent me a test question. So Abby's definitely able to send me questions, but I don't know if anybody else is. That's all I can see. Anyway, so in the meantime, I'm going to ask if, I don't know, do you think it's too crazy to ask all of the panelists to unmute, Patrick? I'd like to sort of engage in some kind of a conversation in as much as we can, in this capacity, and not worry about things being too ordered. I think, let's just unmute and see what happens. So do we have Greg back?
Yes,
okay, here we go. Okay, Greg, good to see you again. So I know that I posed a question to you through email asking, a little bit more about how the process felt for the engineers and the kind of benefits that you saw, through this process. Because, there was there was the kind of the initial introduction and the sort of presenting of the material to the artists, and the artists kind of went away and, kind of absorbed everything. And, everybody sort of had their own process, and there were varying levels of conversation and interaction afterwards. But, I'm really interested in hearing sort of, how the experience was for you.
It's been amazing, the response from our team. So we have engineers and meteorologists on the team, and they're passionate about their work. They love severe weather. They like understanding the impacts on society, trying to do something about it. And then when they see the art, it does a few things. It engages their emotions, and so I think it's helping us see the world in a different way. So I think what's common about artists and engineers, and maybe I should tread carefully here because I'm not a philosopher of art kind of person. I am an engineer. But I think we're trying to understand the world in our different disciplines. We have different tools and different methods, but we're looking at the world and trying to understand it. And so when I listen to all of these presentations of the art, that's what I'm hearing, is this engagement with the world and understanding it. It helps me as an engineer understand the world better, helps me understand what I'm doing better in the context of that. And that conversation, I think, is really important. And so our team, you know, when we have a chance to go see the art at the gallery and the previous one that Patrick discussed, the engagement was there's just excitement about it because there is this new way of seeing the world through these different eyes than we normally used. And I was really thrilled that Joel showed my colleague Gurma Bitsu-Amlak there, because he was thrilled too, and he brought his children to the art show. And it really engaged. And so even as parents, it allowed us to engage with our children in a way that they could understand. And that's sometimes hard as an engineer. So I think this kind of conversation that we have, borrowing Patrick's word, rather than collaboration, I think is really important and has a lot of value.
Thanks, Greg. Does anybody want to respond in any way? And or actually, before I have anybody respond, maybe I think Joel looks like he might like to. I'm also just going to see if any of the participants want to ask any questions. It's a bit unclear as to whether or not I can't see questions because there are none, or if I can't see the questions because of something in the settings. So actually, you know what I'm going to do is, if I know that Roberta is here. Roberta, can you just put something in the Q&A, because that way I'll know if I'll know that the attendants can or the attendees can post something there. So if Roberta can post something there, then if she's still there. Oh wait, yes she is. Okay, fantastic. So I can definitely see the questions. Actually, I'm gonna, before I get to Roberta's question, Joel, did you want to respond to Greg?
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to say, Greg, it was an incredible opportunity to be able to talk so deeply. You know, Gurma and I had at least 3 hours of conversation very in quick succession, and he introduced me also to one of his postdocs who was working on visualization, and it was really great. We had almost had a team meeting. My graphic designer, myself, Gurma, and his PhD student, and his postdoc. We just were looking at some images, and we were looking at and really talking about ideas, you know, images and ideas. It was great. I mean, I could just talk about what Roberta is asking about. You know, after having this conversation, would you see any follow-up? Would you adopt any of the methods of other participants? You know, I will say firstly that this project for me personally was really about sound and embodying sound, and so like looking at the ways that Ellen and Eeva have worked together, and looking at the ways that Matt has introduced that element into the structural confines of the wood and the trunk. You know, these are really, really inspiring for me. And when I was talking to Prof. Gurma, we were talking a lot about sustainable architectures and the wind loads on these, you know, and possibly at beach waterfront areas and sustainable housing for the homeless as well. And you know, that seemed to be something that was a passion of his, and I don't want that relationship between us, or that's this experience to go you know, to go explored. So thanks again.
Thanks, Joel. I'm wondering if anybody else wants to leap in. Actually, Roberta is asking about sort of any possible continuations of the project once the current limitations are due to the pandemic, once these limitations are over. So I'm not really sure if she's specifically asking you, Joel, or if she's asking Greg, you know, or the gallery.
Well, if it's me, the answer is yes.
Yeah, and I think, in fact, I think in general, the answer is kind of yes. You know, there are potential ways that we might be able to expand on this project in the future, although they have yet to be sort of deeply discussed. So I don't know if anybody else, oh, okay, Ellen is raising her hand. Also, I just want to mention that you guys do have a raise hand button as participants. So you can also you can either raise your hand physically or you can raise your hand with the button. But Ellen would like to respond.
Well, and, one of the questions you had sent out, Helen, had to do with experimental interdisciplinary approaches to art or to research. And where I find there's a lot of richness is in the proposition. It's not in the answer. You know, it's in being given something to then need to work through how to move forward with it. And then I will say, as somebody who's in the arts, it is about process and transformation and morphing, you know, so that it's not a linear way of moving from the initial question to an endpoint, but it opens, you know, a myriad of directions and challenges and predicaments that then fuel what the resolutions are in the long run, but that then itself spans other ways of thinking more broadly. So I don't know if this, with Greg, you said how it was exciting for you that there's a sort of this stimulation because of seeing the artwork to look at the world differently. And for me to hear somebody say that, I get delighted by that. I also know that by receiving, again, I'll call it a proposition, by receiving sort of the mandate to move in a certain direction as a project, that then is a way of looking at the world differently too. You know, so I would not have seen how to think about tornado research in relation to sound art without this project.
Thanks, Ellen. So Hannah has raised her hand, but first of all, I'm just going to say we're at 6:30, which is technically the end of this, but I'm game to keep on going. So, you know, I'm going to let this thing run its course. If anybody, you know, obviously if any of the viewers need to leave, then that's okay. If any of the panelists have like something super pressing that they have to leave for, that's also okay. But, you know, I'm going to run this thing a little bit longer if, you know, if everybody's okay with that. So Hannah, I see you've raised your hand.
Yes, I found the button. Yeah, I'm gonna say I thought it went till 7, so
Oh,
I'm
awesome.
just fine. I don't know if I'm just wrong, but anyway, I'm kind of curious how many of the rest of you have seen the show. Yeah,
people in London.
Lucky. I'm like, thank you for sharing, because I haven't seen the show. And I just wanted to say, Ellen, I thought it was so beautiful how you talked about this idea of writing on the earth to try and have this installation that is doing the writing of the earth or giving voice to the earth. I thought it was really lovely. There were many things I really enjoyed about this, but I'm just gonna, the question of how do you see this continuing, I kind of saw this as a really nice opportunity, Helen, for you to talk about the catalog. As much as I would like to know about the catalog too, just you've talked about it a little bit, but I know you've got these great writers and it's going to be what, tell us about the catalog, Helen.
It's a work in progress. Let's just try to, so we have Lindsay Dawn, what's Lindsay's last name? I'm trying to remember.
Dobbin.
Pardon?
Dobbin.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
So we have Lindsay Dawn Dobbin, who's working on something right now. She's doing more of a sort of a creative writing project. Paige Hershey is a PhD student at U of T, and her background is in sort of the history of art and science. And so she's already finished her essay, which kind of positions the whole conversation in sort of a historical trajectory. I'll be writing an essay where I sort of try to tie together the whole project and talk a little bit about everybody's work individually. Paige didn't specifically address the individual works because, you know, under the circumstances, she wasn't, you know, really able to come and look at anything. And it really put her, I think, at a disadvantage. So I gave her the option of like just sort of choosing to kind of provide a historical context. And yeah, so we're just working away at it. and this is, again, something that is being, supported by the engineering department, by the Northern Tornadoes Project. I believe that Patrick may be working on something with Greg, sort of a, I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn when I say that, but Patrick and I have discussed the possibility of he and Greg, writing something together that's perhaps like a Q&A or, like an interview or a dialogue kind of situation. So yeah, that's going to be the kind of the physical thing that lingers into the future. But there are possibly other future things that are undeveloped, and I can't sort of say anything because I'm afraid of committing to anything or saying anything that doesn't come to pass or whatever. But yeah, so there's definitely a catalog. So let's see. Oh, we have another question here. We have okay. So here's a question. Do you think each distinct discipline, art and science, augmented the effects of the weather or helped that which is invisible become visible? So this isn't addressed at a particular artist, so I don't know if anybody would like to respond to that.
I could respond because I know Bushra, who wrote the question. It's a really interesting question and difficult, I think. I think if I try and understand what she's asking, what you're asking, Bushra, I think that it seems as if maybe there's a question around whether, in a sense, for me as an artist, science helped to make the weather or the kind of problem of weather more sort of concrete, absolute, or something, this other part of the question about making the invisible visible. And I probably would say that, when we were starting to put this part of the project together, I was thinking about evidence and artists dealing with evidence. And that seemed almost to be about documentary, and that some artists really take seriously the need to kind of report on what's happening in the world in a way that has a certain level of what I guess I would call veracity. But I think as this project went along, it seemed to me that people were really interested, and I don't want to generalize, maybe I'll speak for myself, but interested in the idea that the invisible is somehow more visible to us. And yet I think that that for me, that was fostered through, I guess, the science. So I guess as a simple example, and it goes back to what Hannah was saying, the idea of writing on the earth, when you look at those photographs and you see what's happening with those trees, there's a real visceral sense of a kind of evidence, but that is telling a story which is not merely, how many trees went down over how much time. There's meaning there. And so for me, I think that that's where some of the excitement of this kind of project comes into being, because I think the science can maybe speak in ways, when we look at it as artists, it can maybe speak in ways that we're not always aware it's doing.
So that's the end of our audience questions. So maybe I'll just bring it back to one of the questions that I sent out to the group, which was that when we think about tornadoes, we usually think about their destructive capacity. And given the inherent nature of the subject matter, the potential to sensationalize or aestheticize disaster by treating destruction as a creative material is very real. However, the artists in this exhibition created work that is sensitive and poetic and never veers into the territory of disaster porn. I'm wondering if any of you would like to say a little bit about the kinds of creative strategies that you employed to create work that is subtle and beautiful, but also very powerful. And I understand that to a certain degree, these things have been addressed a little bit already, but maybe, maybe there are other things to be said.
I think Hannah.
Yeah, I think because it's kind of what you're saying is relating to the last question that I wanted to respond to as well, to sort of follow up on what Patrick was saying. Because it's actually something I will often say in my, when I talk about my work, is sort of this idea of making something that is invisible tangible, or visible. And it's something that I really picked up on in hearing everybody talk about their work. Was most people emphasize the idea of relationships, and this idea of highlighting relationships, or working with the idea of relationships. And I felt that really came through in the works that we saw. It's the relationships between phenomena, the senses. And so I think maybe that idea of, in my mind, maybe it's science has sort of the data, and that we've then looked at sort of the relationships that come out from within the data that's there. So it's different aspects. Though I really, that idea of having an anthropologists go and talk to people, Greg, that you mentioned that is part of the project, I found really interesting too. I hear the word anthropologist and I kind of shudder, but at the same time, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess it's, yeah. So that also is an aspect of looking at relationships that you don't necessarily think of science embracing necessarily. So anyhow, that was, I think, sort of an answer to what you were asking, Helen, but also tying into the question that Patrick had just answered. I don't know. What do y'all think?
I,
Go, Matt.
Go, Matt.
Yeah, it's an interesting prospect. The artist's job or the scientist's job is to sort of make the invisible visible. And I remember sort of speaking of back to the earlier question of this idea of ruin porn, which sounds slightly vulgar, but I guess it is sort of a vulgar tactic. Maybe I'm kind of cruel to the word because I think that used to be a big part of my earlier art practice. I used to do a lot of photographs in suburban areas where they sort of take what was quite a beautiful landscape, and this is sort of almost like a tornado, like a finger of God that just sort of rips through and churns everything up. And in large part, I was trying to sort of document just what was happening, and almost as a proof for how kind of messed up this whole sort of process is. The same thing, like you sort of revel in this sort of the chaos and the destruction of the tornado or the urban developments. And over a while, I kind of started to realize that I didn't really like the works I was doing. Like, they were sort of important to me, but I didn't want to be around my photographs. They weren't sort of pleasant things to sort of be next to. And I sort of realized, I was trying to invoke people to sort of pay more attention to the landscape around them. But I think I was going about it in the complete opposite direction. I was sort of going about it in a very negative direction, where it's like you sort of scold people for behaving badly. And so the answer to the question, one of the strategies I've sort of really tried to actively embrace in the last few years of my practice is how to sort of positively reward, how to sort of make people want to sort of appreciate more instead of sort of scolding on the negative. And I think in answering that, it kind of makes the idea of ruin porn seem kind of ridiculous. Like it just seems like such a sort of an ineffective strategy. But I think that's my personal experience and how to sort of a strategy to negotiate between those two dichotomies, really.
Thanks, Matt. Anybody else?
I think I'm going to put out a half-baked idea, but why not? And that's to almost twist Bushra's question. So rather than this making the invisible visible, I think a lot of us are making the visible invisible. And the invisible that we're working with are the ideas and the forces of the world. So and the visual then becomes the messenger or the vehicle in order to talk about these other concepts. So I think that runs as a through line in the work.
Nice.
Yeah, maybe I will just respond to that. in order to get an answer to my real question. And that is, because I agree with you, Ellen, and I guess it makes me go back to that question that I want to ask Greg, is a tornado a disaster? Because there's a way in which I think a lot of us probably were resistant to, I mean, if we want to call it disaster porn, whatever, but we were resistant to somehow feeling that that tornado is a problem. Clearly it's a problem to people and houses and all kinds of things lots of times, but I wonder, like, do scientists think of tornadoes as fundamentally problems?
Well, I'd say no. It's a little harder to answer with tornadoes, but maybe let's talk about hurricanes. So hurricanes are of course much larger and destructive over much larger areas of land near the coast, but they play an important role in redistributing heat in the atmosphere. So the oceans are warm, and the hurricanes stir up the water down hundreds of meters, and they mix it, and they bring warm water down and cool water up. So they play this important process of moderating the atmosphere. When we put our houses on a barrier island, well, it's beautiful, right? You have nice beach and sand there, but the barrier island is there as a result of hurricanes, and they move every time one goes over. And so we build in dangerous places. So in the engineering world, we don't actually say there's natural disasters, there's just disasters, and they're caused by what we do and where we build and how we live. And I don't know of an analog for tornadoes in terms of the natural cycle, but certainly the tornado is only a little part of the storm, of the thunderstorm. If you look at photographs of thunderstorms from a great distance, they make very beautiful clouds. They go up tens of thousands of feet, right? And the tornado is just this little bit at the bottom. And so that's, again, moving heat from the Earth's surface where the sun warms it up into the atmosphere and mixing. So it's just part of the natural process of the world. Matt had talked about the water cycle. It's all part of that. So it's just how we build. And as we have suburban sprawl, we talk about a growing bullseye. Are more tornadoes happening? Well, we don't know. We don't really think so. But our footprint on the Earth is growing, and that's getting hit more often. So there's a big human part in this, I think, to answer your question.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, one of the first ideas that came to my mind when I was thinking about tornadoes was its capacity for renewal. Maybe it's not the best, seeing all the destruction, but I was thinking about a documentary that Herzog did about volcanoes, and sitting down, the cameras were turned on him, and they asked him, right, what do you think about volcanoes after hearing all these stories about how destructive it is? Then he said, it captures a potential for refinement, I think, or renewal. And that was something I felt also when I was looking at the tornadoes. To a certain extent, what we do with it is change the temporal structure of this visualization, right? I mean, we all invite people to sit with this instant of destruction and kind of stretch it out, and then it becomes something different in that way,
Do we have any other further comments? Well, if nobody else wants to leap in, I think this would be an apt time to draw things to a close. I just want to thank everybody who attended, and it was very nice to notice that we got almost no drop off at all throughout the entire panel. So everybody stayed, is because, I mean, the subject was amazing and the work is fantastic. And yeah, I've been really pleased to have been involved with this project. So, I really want to thank all of the artists, and Greg, and, everybody at the Northern Tornadoes Project who's not here this evening, but who assisted. Yeah, it's been a really productive, a wonderful, wonderful collaboration. So I just wanted to, thank you all again. And say, what a shame it is that that Joel and Hannah didn't get to see the show, because it really is, it's enormously unfortunate. Patrick and I were discussing the fact that, all things considered, the fact that the show did actually manage to go ahead for 4 weeks, sandwiched in between 2 shutdowns, it's quite miraculous that that we had like 4 really good weeks, and under the circumstances it was really quite well attended. But it is really sad that that Joel and Hannah didn't get to come, but we're continuing to document the show, and we're working on the catalog, and there will be that, and yeah, so that's it. So I just want to thank everybody again for coming, and draw this to a close.
Thank you as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks so
everybody.
much.
Thanks so much.
Well, lovely to see everybody.